This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The holidays mean more travel, more shopping, more time online, and more personal info in places that could expose you to identity theft. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, their US-based restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Get more holiday fun and less holiday worry with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Time to move? Skip the hassles of selling during the holiday season and sell your home directly to Opendoor. Request an all-cash offer in minutes, close, and get paid in days. You can even pick your close date so you can move after New Year's. Start your move at Opendoor.com or download the Opendoor app. Opendoor is represented by Opendoor Brokerage, Inc., license 02061130 in California, and Opendoor Brokerage, LLC in its other markets. Terms and conditions apply.
Hello, Beat Check listeners. This is Joe Freeman, senior writer from the Oregonian and OregonLive, and your host today. Roger A. Pearce Jr. spent 3 decades as a successful attorney in the Northwest, representing prominent people and high-profile businesses in Oregon and Washington. He dedicated his free time to nonprofit boards and planning commissions. He spent countless hours doing pro bono legal work and was part of a happy marriage. By all measures, the name Roger Pearce was synonymous with success and respect, except for one thing. Roger Pearce was not actually Roger Pearce. What is his real name? Who is the real Roger Pearce? Why did a prominent lawyer spend 50 years masquerading under a stolen identity? And how did the truth finally come to light? It's a gripping tale, tailor-made for a movie script. And here to break it all down for us is the person who wrote it, Maxine Bernstein, who covers the federal court and crime and law enforcement for the Oregonian and OregonLive. Max, thanks so much for joining Beat Check today.
Thank you.
How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Joe.
Yeah, good. So this is a fascinating story with so many twists and turns. I don't even know where to begin, but we're going to need to get into this man's background, how and why he assumed a different identity, his professional career, and how his 50-year lie was exposed. But first, briefly, let's delve into the real Roger Pearce. Max, who is the real Roger Pearce?
So the real Roger Pearce Jr. is a deceased infant, who died in Vermont, Montpelier, Vermont, in 1952, I believe. Yes, March 1952. And the Roger Pearce from the Northwest took this dead baby's name when he was in his 20s or so, and completely lived under the false identity of Roger Pearce for more than 50 years.
Amazing. And the original Roger Pearce, it's so weird to have to discern them, but the young baby lived 6 months and 9 days and before dying. And then here we are decades later. Let's move on to the man who became Roger Pearce, the man who stole the baby's identity. What was his birth name? Where is he from? How did he become someone else?
So his birth name is Willie Casper. He was born in Jackson, Mississippi in 1946. He was the older of 2 boys, and he went off to college to Rice University in Texas. And there he dropped out after a year or so. He also was married for a brief time, and that marriage faltered. And this was in the 70s. He began a check fraud, writing checks on a bank account with no money. He said that was part of an anti-war protest against banks during the Vietnam War. And he basically told the court he felt like a failure. He felt ashamed that his parents were paying for his education and that he hadn't lived up to their dreams. He was depressed, confused, and he wanted to start over. And that's what led him to take on this stolen identity.
Wow. It feels like a development of a certain era. It seems like a very difficult thing to do nowadays. How did he, and I know probably a lot of these details are not quite as specific, but how did he, inherit this identity? When did that I think it was 1971, kind of lead us through that. You're looking to start over, and Willie Casper decides to do this.
Right. So he was worried about getting arrested for his check fraud. And if he was living with someone and this friend had been caught renting a car with a false ID, police had come to the house they shared. He wasn't home at the time, but feared police would return looking for him. At least this is what he has shared.
Sure.
And he was in Houston, Texas, had dropped out of school, marriage failed. And he said in 1971, someone offered him a birth certificate for this, to this dead child from Vermont. And it's unclear who that was. His lawyer said birth certificates were apparently easy to come by during the anti-Vietnam era, as others used them to try to evade the draft. And it's unclear if he paid for it or not, but he ended up taking this birth certificate, basically assuming the identity of this deceased baby, Roger Alfred Pearce Jr., using the child's date of birth as well. And he used the birth certificate to apply for a Social Security number in the name of Roger Pearce.
Okay. And foreshadowing that will later come back to get him submitting or applying for a Social Security number as an adult. It raises red flags. But before we get into all that, so he steals the identity and he hits the reset button. He starts over. Fascinatingly, he kind of has a stretch where he lives in New York as a dancer and singer, maybe, and then kind of weaves his way to the Northwest, moves to Montana for a stretch, and then winds up in Seattle, worked for a bakery, and then one day decided, hey, I want to be a lawyer. Is that accurate? And then kind of what's his next move in life?
Yeah. In between that, he ended up, he went to Eugene. He had some friends in Eugene, Oregon, and he apparently took some classes at Lane Community College in the early 70s, made new friends. He said, he told the court he crawled out of being depressed, and within a few years, that name was absolutely normal to him. But
his new name.
Right. His fake name, Roger Pearce.
Yeah.
His lawyer described him as a Renaissance man in court. I mean, describing this stint as a dancer and singer in New York. And then in Seattle, he was working for a bakery, and someone suggested he applied to law school. Apparently at that time, the University of Puget Sound Law School in Tacoma, you could start law school without a college degree. And he ended up attending law school there. He graduated when he was in his mid-40s, and his lawyer pointed out that he graduated first in his class.
Wow. Well, as a 47-year-old man, he is a model to us all, I guess. We should all aspire to be him. Like you said, he graduated number one in his class. He did all of this without, having any bachelor's degree or any education at that level before that. And then he goes on to this wildly successful career, right? He works at Seattle-based firm Foster Pepper, representing Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen and his Vulcan Development Company, which coincidentally ended up owning the Portland Trailblazers. He served as a lawyer for the Seattle Monorail Popular Authority. And he just kind of carves out this whole very successful career. I guess what did he specialize in? What was his kind of area of practice? And then how did he end up in Oregon?
Sure. He specialized in land use, zoning, and real estate law. And that's how he came to represent Paul Allen's Vulcan Development Company. And then he represented the monorail authority in Seattle as they were hoping to expand with the Green Line. He was admitted to the Washington bar in 1991, just when he graduated from law school. And then his lawyer described that he had semi-retired at one point to Oregon, to Ashland, Oregon. And he became very involved in Ashland. He was on the planning commission in Ashland. He also served as a Jackson County hearings officer. He was secretary of the Ashland New Plays Association, and he was very active in the Southern Oregon Land Conservancy, a nonprofit based in Ashland. So, but after some time, he was there in the area of 2017, 2018. He ultimately returned to live in Seattle and right along Lake Washington.
Right. I believe, as I read in your story, he and his wife purchased a $1.7 million home in that prestigious area, right?
Right.
Yeah. Wow. So he lives this wonderful, picture-perfect life. He gets remarried. They have a daughter, I believe. He has this successful career. He gives back to the community. By all accounts, he's not just a model citizen, but a role model. And he, like you said, he volunteers. He does has all these successful ventures. And then at age 77, I believe, his past caught up to him. How did we get to, how was he exposed? How did it all come to be?
So the State Department basically blew his cover. They discovered irregularity in his Social Security number since he had gotten the fraudulent number using the birth certificate of a dead child. At that time, in the 70s, there wasn't technology to immediately flag that as a problem. But later, as he applied for passports and renewal of passports, ultimately in 2022, the State Department's fraud detection program sent up a big red flag when they realized that he had applied for a Social Security number as an adult in reviewing one of his passport applications. And they started to investigate, and they found out that he was not the real Roger Pearce Jr. They, found the actual gravestone in Vermont of the real Roger Pearce Jr., who died at 6 months and 9 days. So usually this State Department fraud detection program turns up, members of the mobsters or people who are fugitives running from the law. And they didn't quite know who this man was. I mean, they knew he wasn't Roger Pearce, but the State Department was unable to figure out who exactly he was. And the prosecutor in the case described it as a case more about who he's not, who the defendant is not, than who he is.
And he ended up having a third identity, John Doe. In 2023, the federal grand jury returned a one-count indictment charging John Doe with making a false statement on his passport application, and he was arrested in Seattle. So that was a year plus ago. And then I can only imagine how big of a surprise that must have been for him. And then obviously, you know, down the road, you run into this story and stumble upon this case. What has been the legal fallout? What has happened? You know, lead us through his trial and his sentence and all that.
He was initially charged with a felony and indicted in early 2023. He was charged with making a false statement in application for use of a passport. And the indictment was U.S. versus John Doe, a.k.a. Roger Pearce. That's how it appeared. And he obtained a pretty fairly prominent lawyer from Oregon, defense lawyer Janet Hoffman. The case just sat. He was out of custody pending the charge, and the date of trial kept getting pushed back until ultimately in August of this year, he pleaded guilty to a lesser charge, a misdemeanor, which was, I believe it was possessing false information to obtain a passport, basically. Mm-hmm. And he had a plea hearing in August. And that was very interesting because at that hearing, initially, from the start of the hearing, the courtroom deputy has to swear the defendant in and asks them for their true name. And that's when it came out, publicly at least. He said, my birth name was Willie Casper Jr. Then he continued, the name I've gone under and been known as for the last over 50 years is Roger Alfred Pearce Jr. And the judge, you know, asked him, asked the defense lawyer, how should I refer to your client? And she kept saying, by Mr. Pearce, still his false name that he's been living under for 5+ decades. So that was in August. And then last week was his sentencing, and federal judge Michael Simon sentenced him to 2 years probation. Under the plea deal, he agreed to relinquish both his Oregon and Washington state law licenses.
Wow. And I read that plea deal briefly, and he had to pay a $25 fine along with the 2 years probation. I think maybe I read that wrong, but I was like, that's like less than a parking ticket. It's so strange. One thing I also noticed is originally the maximum penalty is a year in prison and $1,000 fine. So the plea deal, and his attorney was asking for 1 year probation, and they kind of went back and forth through the from the judge, and the judge settled on 2 years. Did the judge kind of, you know, elaborate on why slightly stiffer penalty?
So, I mean, he still gets much less than he would have had he faced the felony. Under the plea deal, he gets probation. Yeah. Right. And he basically, as a term of his probation, he was ordered not to obtain any new identification that's not under his true name. But that became an issue as well, because he and his lawyer said he intended to immediately go through the legal channels to officially, legally change his name to Roger Pearce, because he's lived under it for so long. And so that sort of became moot, because he, is still going to be able to hold on to the Pearce identification that he uses, Social Security, driver's license, et cetera, financial documents. But he's going to move to change his name officially. The judge did include some questioning about the impact on the victims, and asked, said there hadn't been any mention in the hearing of the true Roger Pearce's family, and the impact on them. And the prosecutor alerted the judge that the infant's parents are deceased, and they're officially considered potential victims under the Federal Crime Victims Act. And so other than that, there was really no further discussion in court on the victim.
This, and I'm so glad you brought that up, because that leads to just another layer of fascination with this. Amazingly, you track down family members of both identities, of Casper and of Roger Pearce, the baby, who turns out was the oldest of 7 kids. You track down his younger sister, Dawn Hittinen, I guess, and then you track down Willie Casper, aka Roger Pearce. You track down his nephew. What did the families have to say? What was their reaction? I can only imagine both sides were stunned.
Exactly. I just couldn't imagine telling this story without reaching out and trying to find out about the true Roger Pearce Jr., whose name had been stolen for 5 decades, or the family that this man had pretty much left behind. In fact, going into the sentencing, I expected to hear a lot more. I expected people to talk about this man, about his past. And at sentencing, it was only the defendant and his wife and his lawyer who were there. So luckily I had done the research prior to sentencing, and I had found an attorney, Roger Pearce, who was tied to to the law firm in Seattle and to Paul Allen's company and to Ashland and to the public Ashland Planning Commission, et cetera. But I still hadn't confirmed that was the actual Roger Pearce who was in court. So after sentencing, I waited to approach the attorney and Casper, basically.
You have to think twice before saying his name.
Yes. Even though he continues to go by Pearce, he's Casper. And I approached them at the very end of sentencing and said, I'm working on a story on this, and I want to confirm that you are the attorney, Roger Pearce, who worked for Vulcan, who was on the Planning Commission in Ashland, associated with, Seattle's monorail system. And there was just kind of silence. And the attorney said, well, you've done your homework. And then I had to confirm that he was the one who went to University of Puget Sound Law School. And the attorney immediately said, yes, he graduated number 1 in his class. So anyway, after that, I had also, as part of that research, found the obituary of the baby's father, who was in the same name of Roger Pearce Sr. And it said Roger Pearce Sr. Was predeceased by his son, Roger Pearce Jr. So, and that was in Vermont. So I found that, and I started to call and leave messages for other surviving siblings. And that's how I reached his younger sister, who's in Arizona. And she, texted me back, why are you looking for family of Roger Pearce? And I explained I was a federal court reporter covering this prosecution of a man who apparently has been living under her brother's identity. And so she immediately called me, and she was just shocked, flabbergasted, hadn't heard anything about this at all. No one in the family had. She had many questions about why this man Casper had ended up with her brother's identity. She said that she remembers her mother frequently talking about her firstborn son, who appeared to, she believed, had died from meningitis. Remembers that he had taken a nap one day, and when he woke up, he had high fever and was rushed to the hospital, and was pronounced dead at the hospital. She was just stunned, and really, I sent her the sentencing memo that the prosecutor had submitted to the court, which laid out the allegations, and provided her as much information as I could. She was sharing it with the rest of her family, but just thought it was crazy, and she was flabbergasted.
Wow. Yeah, that's so much to unpack there. I just can't imagine being, called out of the blue or reached out to out of the blue with such, wild news. And then similarly, on the Casper side of this story, you were able to speak with his nephew. Who is he was one of two sons, and his brother, Dr. Robert Casper, I believe lives in Arkansas, and he's 72. What did his nephew have to say? I believe his name was Justin Casper.
Justin Casper. So I was also trying to find his family, and I found I think it was an obituary related, because he was from Jackson, Mississippi originally. And I found, his father was Willie Reagan Casper. And I left a message because there was one other son, his younger brother. Didn't hear back from him. And I started to reach out to his children, the grandchildren. And I immediately heard back from a nephew, Justin, and he was just immediately stunned. He couldn't believe he's alive. That's what he's alive.
Wow.
He said it was the first he heard anything about his uncle, that this was his dad's long lost brother. He said he didn't know what had happened. He just kind of left, took off, never said where he was going, never had any contact with the family. He thought he had died. And, he said his dad was 72, and that Justin had tried, maybe even like 6 months earlier, thinking he might try to track down his uncle, but he couldn't find anything online about him, and was thinking of hiring a private investigator. So
doesn't need to. He's got Maxine Bernstein. She'll take care of it for him.
So I sent him as much information I could about the man, and I also provided him with a photo. And he was like, he immediately said, "Wow, he looks like me." I mean, he saw the family resemblance, but he was stunned and had tons of questions too.
Wow. Now, I don't know if you can answer this, but has Casper / Pearce expressed any interest to reach out to his family that he essentially just, left 50 years ago?
Yeah, he actually said in court that he wondered if his younger brother would be willing to have contact with him, and he acknowledged that he hadn't seen him in more than 50 years, and said that he had taken, since his arrest, he had taken the time to inform his colleagues, coworkers, family members about his real past, yet he hadn't reached out to his true birth family. And
wow.
So said he hoped this prosecution might give him the chance to recover some of what he lost.
I thought it was interesting that among the people, he had many people kind of testify on his behalf, almost as character witnesses, for the lack of a better term. And there was like a former university president and others who kind of, vouched for his character. I can only imagine what those conversations were like. I mean, he had to go, as you mentioned, to everybody and say, "I'm not really Roger Pearce. I did this 50 years ago." But I mean, he kind of went through that path though. Yeah.
Yeah. I was surprised. I mean, nothing in the court records really identified exactly how prominent this man was, or really anything about his background. And it also didn't come up specifically at all during the sentencing hearing. I was surprised by that.
Mm-hmm.
And it was almost as if, and I think he was surprised to see a reporter in the courtroom that had reached out to his nephew or family. So I don't know. He clearly had to tell people his family members and others who he had worked with. But he didn't immediately reach out to his brother or his other relatives.
Yeah. It's fascinating. I love the details that you've provided just of how you've gone about this. It's one of those kinds of stories that just don't come around that often. It's nice to kind of get a peek behind the curtain. How did you stumble onto the story? How did you kind of approach it early on when you first found out about it?
Sure. So by covering federal court, I checked the docket, and what stood out to me in this case was the name of the case, U.S. versus John Doe. Mm-hmm. And there wasn't much in the record at all. It wasn't clear that right from the get-go that this was an attorney. But once I, started asking some questions and learned he was a lawyer, that making a false statement. And then I went to the Oregon State Bar to try to find out what the bar had on his background, and got, very little, got info on, the law school he graduated from and when he joined the state bar it wasn't in Oregon, not till 2014, but previously in Washington. And I just thought I was going to track the case because it was so unusual and I had so many questions. And then as it got to the plea hearing, that was about a year and a half after the case was originally indicted. Of course, I was out of the country on vacation, and I was bummed by that. But I immediately ordered the transcript, and the court reporter was in a trial, so that was going to take another 30 days. But it didn't matter. I just knew I had to have it before sentencing. Mm-hmm. And then when I got it, and I was reading through it, it's just my jaw dropped, and I know I let out some choice words because it was unbelievable. I mean, that's when it was, that's where I found his real name. And that's when I saw there was an inkling that he had lived under this fake, stolen identity for more than 5 decades. And the plea hearing, the judge just asked why. And he just gave a brief response at that point saying he was a complete failure and that he wanted to start anew, and realized it was foolish and a mistake. But so that once I had that, then I really started to delve into his background.
It's amazing. It's a fun one for sure. I'm sure you get in the muck and you experience all manner of wild tale, but I imagine this is one of the more entertaining ones you've pursued in a long time.
Yes, it will. This stands out, and of course, the sentencing was on my birthday.
Oh, come on!
I worked hard on this one, and I was kept delving and finding more stuff out about him as the day wore on. So anyway, it was worth it.
Well, it was a really fascinating story, and this was a really fun conversation. I can't thank you enough for joining the show, Max. If you're interested in reading her full account of the stolen identity of Roger Pearce, I'll drop a link to her story in the show notes, so check it out. Thanks so much for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. If you like this episode, give us a 5-star rating and review it in Apple Podcasts. It really helps people find the show. And tell a friend. Help spread the word. The best way to support our journalism and stories like this one is with a subscription to the Oregonian and OregonLive. You can do that at OregonLive.com/pod support. Until next time, I'm Joe Freeman, and this was Beat Check.